All right, everybody, we're talking about ecology now. And so, what does the word ecology mean? Let's remind ourselves of the word biology, in which we study life. Biology is the study of life. Bio means life, and then logy is study. And so, obviously, we're talking about the study of something here. So, what does eco mean? Eco means home. And so we are studying our home. And when we study our home, what we're looking for is how living things and non-living things interact. So for example, what are the interactions between the people here and the trees and the grass and the birds? How do they all sort of interconnect? And what are these sort of domino effects? How do they affect each other? All right, so what do you expect from this? What do you think we're going to learn about when we talk about ecology? I'm really sorry, by the way, about this thing popping up constantly. That's really annoying. Okay, so ecology is the study of the interactions of living things with their environment. And so we're going to look at that word environment. The environment includes biotic factors and abiotic factors. And so those are just parts of the environment. That's what that word means. For example, this grasshopper would be biotic, as well as the grass that it is on. This plant is biotic, but the sun is abiotic. The rain is abiotic. And they all interact with each other. They all affect each other. And that interaction is what basically makes an environment. There are different levels to study in ecology. And so, for example, we can look at a single species and how it evolved. We can look at populations and how members of populations interact. So populations are all one species, and so that means that they can all reproduce with each other. To be a member of a population, you must be able to reproduce with other members of that population. But you must also be able to create grandchildren. So it's not enough to just have children. You must be able to have grandchildren. In other words, the offspring that you make with a member of your population must also be able to have children. They must be fertile. You must be able to make fertile offspring. Next, we have the community. So the community is multiple populations together. Ecosystems is including the biotic with the abiotic, and then biome is a group of them. And so let's just look at a picture because I think that's easier. Here we have an individual. We could just study him, or we could study a group of them. They're all the same species. We could also look at a community which has multiple species. And don't forget when you study communities that you have plants too. Plants are also living parts. Then we have the ecosystem, which consists of non-living stuff like the river, the sky, the mountains, but also the communities of living things, all together. And then ecosystems that are similar, we group them into biomes, and it's usually according to latitude where they are on Earth. So for example, the taiga here is the largest biome, and it is all the way across the northern hemisphere at around this latitude. And it has more trees than any other tree. And so how do we identify that? How did I know that that was the taiga? Well, if you look here at the community, we identify biomes by the plants of that community. So I see here that these are coniferous trees, meaning they do not lose their leaves during the winter. And so I know that this is probably a taiga, plus I see bears and moose, and those are common animals for that area. All right, so let's talk about interactions. Here we have the ecosystem. And this level of study, how does the bear and the river affect each other? Okay, so one example I could think of is the bear gets fish from the river. It also sets up territory along the river, which it has to fight other bears for. And so the bear is definitely affected by the river. Now, how the river is affected by the bear is a harder question. So perhaps the bear walks around and disturbs the river bottom, kicking up sediment. Over enough time, the bear could maybe even change the direction of the river. And certainly by its footpath, it kills plants. It is a well-known phenomenon that plants with their root systems can change the direction of rivers. And if bears are constantly walking and killing those plants, then there's a chance that the bear could affect the river. And so what I'm saying here is, if you think long and hard enough about it, everything in this picture is connected. And so here is energy flowing. We have to talk about food chains and food webs. And so when we talk about that, let's start at the beginning here. At the beginning of every food chain, we have what are called autotrophs, and we could also just call them producers. At the next level, we have consumers, which are called heterotrophs. Those mean the same thing. But there are two types of consumers. So obviously the rabbit and the coyote that eats it, they are not the same type of consumers. If a consumer eats a producer, we call it a primary consumer or an herbivore. If, however, the consumer is eating a primary consumer, we call it a secondary consumer, and that is stuff like carnivores and omnivores. They are all secondary consumers. And so what we have here is a flow of energy, which in this case started with the sun. Through photosynthesis, energy was stored in plants. That energy then went to the primary consumer when it ate, and then from that to the secondary consumer. There is a way, however, that this energy can go back to the plant. So how do you think the coyote's energy can go back to the plant? Hopefully you said something about decomposers. And so it's actually the job of the decomposer to bring energy and matter back to the producers. So when this coyote or this rabbit die, their bodies will decompose. Also, they could poop, and that could also decompose, thanks to things like mushrooms growing on dead bodies or poop. And that could break down the matter, and it could go back to the plant. And so actually it's not just that energy flows, it actually energy cycles. So what is a carnivore? Let's do a practice question. All right, so a carnivore here is classified as a heterotroph, which means it's also a consumer. It's a heterotroph because it eats other living things. More specifically, though, it is a secondary consumer. All right, so then what is a plant? A plant is an autotroph, but it is also a producer because those words mean the same thing. Basically, autotroph means that you're automatically making your own food, and producer means that you are producing food, right? And so there are two types, actually. There are what we call photoautotrophs, which are autotrophs that use sunlight. We call a particle of sunlight, a particle of light, a photon, which is why we call them photoautotrophs. And then they use photosynthesis to make their food. There are another type called chemoautotrophs, which also make their own food, and you can guess how? Through chemicals. Chemicals like acids or bases. Acids and bases have potential energy in them, and they can be harnessed the same as sunlight. We find chemoautotrophs in places like caves. Okay. So, food webs and food chains, this is pretty elementary. I think you know what this is. So this would be an example of a terrestrial food chain. Terrestrial means land. And this would be an aquatic or marine food chain, which means water. So marine actually means salt water. If I said fresh water, that would mean, like a lake. So these are two different food chains, but the more realistic picture of an environment is a food web. A food web has a more complete interaction. And so just a couple things to note here. They always begin with producers, which in this case is a plant, and this case is a plant. But sometimes they don't start with plants. So in the ocean, for example, There are types of plankton, and a plankton is a type of organism known as a protist that we will learn about later in the year. A protist is single-celled, a lot like bacteria, but their cells are more like ours. They have a nucleus and they're bigger. And so this particular type of protist is capable of photosynthesis, and that is the start of an aquatic food chain most often. And so it's not only plants. So regardless, though, there are always producers at the beginning. And this means a couple of things. If the producers are always at the bottom, that means they must support the top. It's kind of like a pyramid. It's kind of like a pyramid. The reason it's kind of like a pyramid is because the producers have to support all of these other living things. There is this law of conservation of mass and energy in our universe. Energy cannot be created, nor can it be destroyed, and neither can mass. You can only transfer it. And so in other words, the mass that makes the toad and the owl and the fox and the squirrel, that all came originally from plants. Plants made that. And so that means that the mass of the plants must be more than all of the producers, and so must the energy. That has to always be true. And so this means that we can make pyramids. We can make, for example, an energy pyramid. And so an energy pyramid is what I just described. So this is a food chain here. We have producers on the bottom, and they have to have the most amount of energy stored in them. In this case, we're using kcals, which is a measurement of heat, to describe how much energy is in the producer. That energy flows to the primary consumer when it is eaten, and then from there it flows to secondary consumers in steps. And so then the question is, how much energy flows? Only about 10%. Only about 10% on average. And so that means a lot of energy is lost as heat and waste as this process goes on. And so that has some ramifications. That means that the producers must always have more energy because not all of it gets to the next level. And so a cat, for example, only absorbs a certain percent. And so let's do that calculation here. What percent of the energy does the cat get from this grass? So here, if this is a big thing of grass, these are the grasshoppers that ate that grass. These are the mice that ate those grasshoppers, and this is the one cat that ate those two mice. How much energy from the grass did the cat actually get? All right, so to do the math here, it's always 10%. So the cat is getting 10% from the mouse. But then it's only getting 10% from that grasshopper and then 10% from that grass. And so how do you get 10% of 10% of 10%? To get 10% of something, you just go back one decimal. So for example, if we have 100, 10% of 100 would just be moving the decimal back. So if I said this is 10% of 100, we just move the decimal this way 1. And so 10% of 100 is just 10. And so we remove a 0 essentially each time. And so let's just remove zeros. If this is 10%, that would mean the next one is just 1%. And then we go up one more, we move over another 0, that's 0.1%. And so the cat is only getting 0.1% of the energy stored in the grass. There are also pyramids for mass. Just like energy, mass cannot be created nor destroyed. It can only be transferred in form. And we know this because we go to the bathroom, right? After you eat a cheeseburger, eventually, you will use some of the mass to help create the mass of your body, but you will excrete the rest of it. And so mass must also be conserved because not all of it goes up the next level. And so the producers must always weigh more than the consumers. This shape has to always be a triangle or a pyramid. However, numbers can be different. So here's a pyramid of numbers. Now in this case, there's plankton, which of course are going to outnumber fish, and those fish are going to be outnumber their predators, and those will be greater than the birds, right? So in this example, there are more producers, but that's not always true. Can you think of an example of when we could have a numbers pyramid that looks like this? So an example would be, say we have two environments. Let's say the producers in one environment are trees, but the producers in the other environment is grass. In both cases, there is mass. If we weighed all the grass and we weighed all the trees, they would weigh a lot more than everything that eats it. But it takes less trees than it does grass to make up that mass and that energy. And so for the trees, we would have a pyramid like this because there's not many trees. But on those trees, there might be 1 million ants. And then there might be 10,000 insects that eat those ants. And then a few hundred birds that eat those insects. And then a couple of snakes on that tree. And so the beginning here, in terms of numbers, is small because you only need 1 or 2 trees to support all that. Whereas if you start with grass, you're going to need a lot of grass to support grasshoppers that then support toads that then support snakes, right? So you need this shape with small producers, but you can have this shape with big producers. So for the 3 pyramids, energy is always this shape, mass is always this shape, but numbers can be many shapes. They can be all sorts of crazy shapes. All right, so why must the mass of producers on Earth weigh more than the sum of all consumers on Earth? Think about that for a moment. Okay, again, the reason why is because producers are the original mass that is absorbed by consumers, and you don't absorb all of it perfectly. There's always waste. And so the answer really is waste. There's always waste every time you eat. You don't absorb all of the mass of the thing you ate. That would be crazy if you did, right? Imagine if every time you had a steak, that much weight was permanently added to you. That would be crazy. All right, so now we're going to talk about matter cycling, and I will leave this for the next lecture.